So we're ready to get started. Catherine, did you want to go ahead and lead? You're on mute.
Thanks for that reminder. All right, let's get started. As I understand it, the first agenda item is always approval of the minutes from the prior meeting. So from January 23rd, does anyone have any comments or questions about those minutes?
I'll make a motion.
All right, then.
Second.
Approve the minutes as drafted.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And second, trustee Wong.
Yep.
All right. We'll vote. Everyone in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Motion passes, and the minutes are approved from the last meeting. Next up is the introduction of visitors and public comments at this point, if that's appropriate. Sam, do you know if we have any, or Julie, any visitors here?
Nope, I think who you see is who you have. In this meeting, we didn't have public comment. Just I was trying to push. I think people wanted to talk are going to talk in the May meeting.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, then it sounds like we're ready for some action. So let's go to action item number 1, which is the annual adjustment review for the FPDR 2 retiree benefits. Do we have a presentation on this?
Yes, I am here to talk about that. For the record, I am Stacy Jones, the FPDR Pension and Finance Manager. And every year about this time, I come to talk to you about whether the board would like to award a cost of living adjustment to our FPDR 2 retirees and surviving spouses, which the board has historically done every year and awarded for July 1st every year. So we like to talk to you about it a little bit early, so you have a couple of meetings to talk about it if there are questions and issues. I'm going to go ahead, well, here, actually, before I share my screen, let me just say a few words, is that you guys all know, I think, that normally I have a whole big, long presentation about this, but I decided to spare you all that this year because we don't have any new trustees. All of you went through this process at least once last year. Some of you have been through it many times. So I didn't want to waste the board's time going through all the background, at least in great detail. We will have to do that again next year because we will at least have a board chair. But for this year, I thought you didn't need to sit through all of that background again. And in addition, the economic situation is really very similar to last year, which led me to believe that, that we have the same board as we did last year and a similar economic situation. It is most likely that the board is going to want to take similar actions. So I also have not prepared a whole spectrum of different options for the board to consider this year. All of that said, if I'm wrong about any of that, and the board wants to take a look at some additional options after I've kind of hit the highlights of the memo I sent you all, we are happy to have my staff go back and take a look at different options, different ideas, and then we could come back to you at the May meeting to solidify the board's direction on a cost of living adjustment for FPDR2s. So that is why I don't have my normal big, long presentation this year. But I do want to walk through the highlights of the memo that I sent you with your board materials before I turn it over to you for discussion or further direction from me. So let me go ahead and just share my screen. Let's see. Let me know when everyone can see that.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Okay. So first, I just wanted to mention the FPDR ones. There is no action or decision for the board to take with respect to FPDR ones because their pensions are just 1% of active duty police officer and firefighter pay on July 1st each year. So this is just informational. But you can see up on the screen, sorry, I'm looking to my right, which is where it is on my screen, that the active duty police officers are going to receive a 5% cost of living adjustment on July 1st. So our FPDR 1 fire retirees will also receive a 5% cost of living adjustment. And you can see how that impacts our beneficiaries here, and that the total cost for the fund next year will be less than $30,000. My costs throughout this assume that no one in our population dies or no new retirees happen, which is of course, silly. That's not going to happen. But just to give you a sense of the scale of the costs, that seemed the simplest approach. So the cost will be fairly small because that population is pretty small. We only have 141 retirees. The Portland Firefighter Association contract is not settled yet. Their contract expires June 30th. So we don't know, quote unquote, what kind of COLA they're going to get on July 1st yet. But if we assume that they go ahead and get that same 5% that the police officers are getting, then the cost would be very similar, around $25,000. And there are, just a few fewer fire beneficiaries than there are police. And also just for everyone's information, if the fire contract settles after July 1st, as often happens, let's imagine it settles in December, but there is a cost of living adjustment retroactive to July 1st for our active duty firefighters, then we will also give that 5% COLA to our FPDR 1 fire retirees and surviving spouses retroactive for July 1st. So that is how that works. So now, are there any questions about the FPDR 1s? And remembering those are folks who, for the most part, are folks who were already retired in 1991 or the surviving spouses of folks who retired in 1991 or earlier. So now let's move on to the decision that the board does have to make, which is for the FPDR2 beneficiaries, which is the vast majority of our retiree population at this point. So I'm just going to scroll up in my memo. Sorry if I'm making everyone dizzy. So just as a reminder, the board can award any percentage rate increase at once between 0 and 2%. So you don't have to award anything, and the maximum you can give is 2%. And if anybody needs me to recap, why that is, I'm happy to, but that's a charter limitation. Historically, the board has always awarded some kind of cost of living adjustment, and it's always been effective July 1st. The first thing that the board usually wants to know is about inflation. And so I have just highlighted that in my memo here, that there's a lot of different indices, but the index that we use, as does PERS for this purpose, is the CPIU West. And that was 6.25% for calendar year 2022. So it's not as bad as 2021, but it is still very high by historical standards. And since the board not mostly, last year the board explicitly, because inflation was similarly high, the board wanted to award the maximum 2% COLA to all of the FPDR1 beneficiaries. So I have assumed that that's at least where the board wants to start the conversation again this year. Again, if that's not the case, I'm happy to come back in May with other options, additional information, any analyses that the board might want. But what, excuse me, spring break also brought a lovely cold to our house. Included in this memo, I've just shared with the board what a 2% COLA would look like. You can see we have a lot more FPDR2 beneficiaries, about 1,800 of those. It would cost about $250,000 next year to give them all a 2% COLA. That would result in, dollar terms, a median monthly increase of about $128 a month for those folks. Of course, the range is very large because the size of the pensions is very large. The median increase is actually not that different than for the FPDR1s. And even though this is a 5% adjustment versus only 2% for the FPDR2s, and that, of course, is because the FPDR2 pensions are so much larger than the FPDR1 pensions. Yes, and again, just noting that in reality, this cost will be a little bit higher because I have not assumed any underlying changes in the population, but in reality, there'll be a few more FPDR2 retirees than we have right now next year. But not significantly different. So that is what a 2% COLA would look like. Also in the memo, I have background, kind of, just a really brief recap of the historical background. For the COLA, you have all at least heard about it a time or two, and Kathy has really lived it, I think. And then I also just listed some considerations, various, issues that the board has talked about over the years when they've been talking about the COLA. Obviously inflation, which, since the purpose of a COLA is to help maintain purchasing power for retirees. So of course the board always wants to know how inflation is comparing to any COLA that we give. Obviously the maximum COLA you can give this year will be significantly below inflation. But the board also, of course, is concerned with taxpayer cost, any risk of a COLA approach or methodology, any risk that entails for hitting the cap in the levy at some point, whether or not the board is interested in maintaining a strong connection, a loose connection, or no connection to the PERS methodology, which is referenced in the charter, but only with regard to setting a limitation on the amount of the COLA. And then, of course, just the whole economic context that both taxpayers and retirees are living in are some of the things that the board has wanted to talk about in the past. So that is my very brief presentation for this year, and probably this year only, since we are lucky enough not to have new trustees. So before I take questions and ask if any additional information would be desirable, let me just tell the board what you can do. Today, you can approve a 2% COLA for all retirees. It's option 1. 2 is that you can approve some other COLA, which could be anything between nothing and 2%. Or 3, you can tell me that you want some more information, you want some more analysis to take a look at some other options for May. And with that, let me ask if there are any questions, because I know skipping over all that background, I've never done that. I've made you sit through excruciating detail and everything that's happened for the last 20 years. Does anybody need me to recap any of that or go over any of that?
I have just one question, and I think I know the answer, but I think it's good to say it out loud, and that is that the actuarial valuation anticipates for liability purposes and tax levy analysis is anticipating a 2% COLA in all years. Is that correct?
Actually, that is not correct. They have continued to assume a blend, because that is what the board, let's see, the 1.75% and 2% blend split around the October service is what the valuation assumes. And they did that. We actually talked about that quite a bit with this most recent valuation, because they felt that the board had really explicitly said, we're going with the 2% because of this very high inflation. And their assumptions don't assume that very high inflation continues over the life of the plan. We did go with that blend. Now, practically speaking, the difference between the 2% and a 1.75-2% blend is not, enormous, but the valuation does reflect that blend right now.
Okay.
The budget, on the other hand, and the 5-year forecast includes the 2%.
Okay, so the 5% forecast does keep it in there, but the long-term valuation is assuming that blending of the 1.75 and the 2. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Does anybody else have any questions or comments about the background? All right, I would entertain a motion about.
Actually, may I ask real quickly, if you don't mind? This is for Stacy or Sam, I suppose. You put under considerations there, Stacy, the third bullet, desirability or not of maintaining a connection to the PERS COLA methodology. I mean, clearly it's undesirable in this instance, in last year's instance, for our retirees. It puts a cap on I think the 2% cap, which represents an erosion of benefits for those retirees and their surviving spouses. That consideration, though, as I understand it, was not even really available for discussion before. That's just the way that the charter reads, and there's no way to get around that without charter change language. Sam, is that correct?
That is correct. It's explicit in the charter that we don't exceed PERS maximum amount.
Right. So it's not really consideration. We don't have that ability to consider that. It's already written in the charter.
Yeah. So Trustee McClary, what I meant by that was not desirability or not of maintaining that cap, that limitation, that 2%. You don't have a choice about that. It's just written into the charter. I meant the desirability or not of maintaining a connection to the PERS methodology, specifically the PERS methodology, which the board did maintain from most of the time. From 2015 onwards, the board maintained a connection to the PERS methodology, which was to split around service credit pre and post October of 2013.
Yeah.
And so that's what I meant by the board has talked about, hey, we're stuck with this limitation, like that's just there. But prior to the PERS COLA methodology changing, the board used the PERS COLA methodology. The methodologies were identical. And so I think after the PERS methodology changed, the board had an interest in maintaining a connection to that exact PERS methodology. And so, but some board members have said, why are we doing that? That doesn't make sense. The PERS methodology reflects a PERS reality. It doesn't reflect an FPDR reality. We're stuck with the limitation, the 2%, but we don't have to use their methodology. And so that was the debate that I was trying to highlight there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, would someone like to make a motion about the level of the COLA for this July 1 increase?
I'd like to make the motion to at least to discuss the 2% as we did last year. Looking at the individual numbers, $128 extra doesn't seem extreme to me for the FPDR 2 folks. The FPDR 1 folks, I don't think $165 a month extra is too much of an increase as well, considering what they're facing currently. Does anybody have any opposition to that?
None from me. Any other trustees have thoughts or comments?
My only comment, if I may, I remember we had a long discussion about this last March, I believe. In the end, it was, I think, Trustee McLeod ended the discussion with, it's a no-brainer that we land on 2%. I feel like we're in the same position today.
Yes, I agree. I think that's reasonable in light of the cost of living, I mean, in light of inflation, I think 2%. I mean, I wish we could go higher, but unfortunately, we're at that cap. So I agree with the 2% as well.
I think we're all in agreement. That's a very good sentiment. It would be nice to have more flexibility, but we have what we have, and 2% is the maximum. Would someone like to make a motion about the specific COLA?
I'd like to make a motion that we make the COLA 2% at the maximum for the next year, starting July 1st.
I second.
Okay, all those in favor of the motion to approve that 2% COLA increase signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, motion passes.
Great.
Thank you, Stacy.
Yes, you guys made that really easy. Now, that's the fastest we've ever approved a COLA, right?
Well,
Really?
the economics have made that as Trustee McClover said, a no-brainer. So it's nice to have those every once in a while.
And nice to have the same set of trustees who have, have all the background on this issue and a good grasp on that. The next action item is mine as well. So Chair McLeod, if it's okay, I'll just get into it, which is the Milliman contract or the actuarial contract. So let me talk about that a little bit. A few weeks ago, when we first sent the board materials to you, we didn't quite have a fully hammered out contract, but now we do. So the good news is that we are asking the board to approve the entire contract right now. We're not asking you to just approve the key contract parameters and then authorize Sam to complete the detailed negotiations. We've completed negotiations with a fully in place contract at this point. It still has to go through because they won't complete this until you approve it. Kind of that high level procurement review and legal review. So it's always possible they'll make us change a word or two. But it's already been through legal review with both on our side and Milliman's side and the final negotiations. So I have a final contract to go over with you today. So our current actuarial services contract expired last Friday on March 31st. And as the memo that I sent the board, you also have a memo on this topic, tries to explain why we have to have actuaries. We're legally required to have actuaries calculate our plan liability every 2 years and to prepare all of the required financial reporting schedules for both our audit, our standalone audit, and for the city's ACFR, the city's annual comprehensive financial report, since we are a blended component unit of the city. And then we also use actuaries for some other things that are not legally required. We use the actuaries to conduct a levy analysis in concert with the plan liability calculation. So they do that every 2 years, and you're all familiar with that. We also have them, as is a best practice, conduct an experience study of our plan every 5 to 6 years or so to develop a lot of the long-term assumptions that we use both in the valuation and in our budget and for some other purposes throughout FPDR and around the city. We also have the actuaries calculate pension divisions in accordance with court orders related to divorces when we need to spread those over expected life. And then we also can use our actuaries to do any other actuary analysis or provide any other actuarial guidance that either FPDR staff or the board feel they need on an ad hoc basis. So those are the reasons that we need a contract with an actuarial firm. So after a full, we did the full-blown, full competitive RFP process with the city, this time under all the city procurement rules and guidelines. Issued an RFP on December 15th of last year, and then proposals were due on January 31st of this year. And then a selection committee spent several weeks reviewing the proposals we received and scoring them. And then that selection committee did recommend that we award our current actuarial firm, Milliman, the new contract as well. And we are proposing a 5-year contract. So let me tell you a little tiny bit about the selection process. The selection committee was myself, Trustee McLeod, who, as you I think all know, is an actuary, the Portland City Controller, a financial analyst on my team, and an evaluator from the city's minority evaluator program. And then points are awarded based on a very rigid system based on project approach, cost, the proposed project team, the firm's overall capabilities, and then corporate responsibility. So that was how the proposals were evaluated. Milliman received the most overall points and was also the top scorer for each individual member of the selection committee. So that made it a fairly easy decision. So let me once again share my screen and just kind of run through some of the highlights of that memo and the highlights of that contract, and then I will answer questions. Share again. Let me know when you can see the contract deliverables and pricing table. So in red and striped through here, I have the 2 changes from the memo that you received with your original board materials. We have increased the price of the experience study to $40,000. And that is because I told Milliman I wanted an actual formal experience study report. They always do an experience study presentation to the board, but I really wanted a detailed, fully appendices report. And so that's going to cost an extra couple $1,000s. I also wanted a cap on the annual price increases that they wanted to connect to the CPIW, just given recent experience. So Milliman did agree to a 5% annual cap on any price increases, but price increases, some things don't have price increases. They're not going to increase our pricing each year for DROs, for example, but some things do, and those will follow the CPIW with that 5% cap. So those were the 2 things that kind of changed here at the last minute, just to let you guys know about that. Looking down at the not to exceed amount, and we are proposing a not to exceed amount of $350,000 for a 5-year contract. And this is what that $350,000 is made up of. If you look at all of these deliverables and pricing, really just in this top half, these are the things that we know for sure are going to happen. We will have to have an experience study. We'll have to have 2 plan valuations. We'll have to have 2 tax levy analyses. We will need GASB schedules. These are the financial reporting schedules. I mentioned we need those every year. And we will need DROs calculated. And those are the pension divisions associated with divorces. So this is estimated because we never know how many DROs we'll get in any given year. The other thing that's estimated is inflation. And so how much will Milliman's prices go up for those items that are going to go up with inflation? That's also estimated. But we do know that all of these things will be delivered. And then we've built in some cushion and some time for any ad hoc work that the board might want to have over the next 5 years, which it's just very hard to anticipate, what that might be. So we always want to have a little bit of room for that. And then a little bit of cushion, mostly to manage if inflation is higher than I'm projecting here. These are the city economist inflation projections. Or if there are more DROs than we are estimating. And so that's how we get to that $350,000. So the next steps really for the board, before I take questions, just so you all know, is that, like I said, I have struck out because these minor items we have reached agreement on. We don't need to do that. We don't need to complete negotiations. We've done that. So if the board were to approve this contract today with any changes that you wanted to see or anything like that, and then we will go on for Milliman to sign the contract, and then the city attorney's office, chief procurement officer, sign it, and then it gets into, you know, the city auditor's office and the system so that we can move forward with the work. So that is the whole process. I do know that a member of the public submitted some written testimony about this as well. But before we talk about that, let me ask if there are any questions from the board about the contract, the work, the selection process, any concerns?
Hey, Stacey, I have a quick question about the experience study. Any reason why, maybe I'm just not reading this correctly. Any reason why you didn't adjust, going back to the cap, sorry, the next page.
Here?
Keep going down to the next page. Yeah, any reason why you stuck with 38 for 20? Yeah.
I just didn't update it.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Yeah, okay.
Pure typo. Yeah, pure typo right there. So it would actually then be 352, but since we built in a bunch of cushion and ad hoc work, yes, pure typo. I forgot that was down in here, needed to be adjusted as well. I'm sorry.
No worries, thanks. And the purpose for a formal written report is for validation or
It is more because that is one thing that gets somewhat widely shared around the city. And so, you know, anything that's in the presentation that I want more detail on or I want to dig into is, you know, I'll just pick up the phone and talk to Milliman and we'll talk through it. But having a really like formal report is useful to other folks at the city, like the police and fire bureaus are obviously very interested in the probability of people retiring and getting disabled and all of those other things as well. So it's a little more shareable. And then, you know, the other piece is that anyone who is reads our valuation seriously, which, you know, I don't know how broad the audience is for that, will know that, you know, all of the assumptions are, you know, the underlying assumptions mostly come from that experience study. And having a really well-documented experience study, I think, increases faith in that valuation. So it's not out of any concern that, you know, it's just to have a nicer, neater, more formal deliverable for that product.
we agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I agree as well. I think it's, you know, in work that I've done, I'm surprised the number of times that going back to review the formal issued report is helpful as opposed to just looking at the tables that were derived and applied. So it gives you good background about, you know, when assumption wasn't or was changed and to what extent, et cetera, and helps compare, you know, the actual to expected results, and then you can see the new revised assumption from there. So I think it is really helpful to see a formal report. That's a good question. Does anybody else have any other questions about the contract itself or the approval process? All right, before we go to approving this contract, should we hear the comments that were submitted?
Yes, and Julie, I don't know if we read them or when someone submits written testimony, I'm not sure how that works.
Well, I'm not sure either. I had thought that Mr. Machis would join us today. I'm saying his name wrong, I think, but I mean, if you would like, I could read it.
Or can we perhaps enter that commentary into records, and that can someone just basically summarize his points, and then certainly for a layman like myself would be helpful to really understand you know, the conflict that he raised with respect to the contract versus the what was it, the ASOP number 4. So,
You know, in full transparency, Julie, if you don't mind, can you read it so we know exactly what he says?
Definitely. So this was an email to Sam. It says, Director Hutchison, I am submitting this written public comment in reference to the April 4th, 2023 board materials, specifically a memo from staff to the FPDR Board of Trustees regarding an actuarial services contract with Milliman under action item 2. The memo's description of the contract's purpose is inconsistent with actuarial standards of practice number 4, measuring pension obligations and determining pension plan costs or contributions. And in quotes, he put ASOP number 4, which is how he will refer to it going forward. ASOP number 4 was adopted by the Actuarial Standards Board in December 2021 and became effective February 15th, 2023. ASOP number 4 states that the actuary should, in quotes, calculate and disclose a reasonable actuarially determined contribution. This memo states that the purpose of the contract shall include addressing, in quotes, the adequacy of the capped FPDR tax levy to fully fund FPDR plan benefits over 20-year periods in concert with the biannual plan valuation, end quote. The memo goes on to claim that, in quote, FPDR's status as a pay-as-you-go plan means that FPDR does not require, end quote, actuarial services that would include calculating, another quote, a required annual contribution to maintain the funded level of the plan and or develop a strategy and recommendation to pay down any unfunded liability, end quote. FPDR's levy adequacy analysis and any potential accompanying formal report document on the same subject would meet the definition of a funding valuation under ASOP number 4. ASOP number 4 defines a funding valuation as a measurement of pension obligations or projection of cash flows performed by the actuary intended to be used by the principal to determine plan contributions or to evaluate the adequacy of specified contribution levels to support benefit provisions. The annual comprehensive financial report of the City of Portland further confirms reliance on this analysis. The current levy is $1.20 per 1,000 of taxable real market value. This dedicated property tax levy has been sufficient in all years to meet required annual benefit payments, and its adequacy to make future payments is tested regularly. The most recent levy adequacy analysis, completed as of June 30th, 2020 by the FPDR plan's independent actuary, again confirmed the ability of the tax levy to fully cover future benefits and plan expenses when due under a wide range of most likely scenarios. ASOP number 4 directs that, end quote, when performing a funding valuation, except where the actuarially determined contribution is based on a prescribed assumption or method set by law, the actuary should also calculate and disclose a reasonable actuarially determined contribution, end quote. ASOP number 4 defines an actuarially determined contribution as, quote, a potential payment to the plan as determined by the actuary using a contribution allocation procedure. It may or may not be the amount actually paid by the plan sponsor or other contributing entity, end quote. In conclusion, I hope the FPDR Board of Trustees sees the inherent value of transparency as the Actuarial Standards Board did in adopting this newly effective actuarial standard of practice. And it's signed Kevin Matchis, CFA FRM. Opinions expressed herein reflect only the authors.
Thank you.
Thank
You bet.
And I think I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who we sort of asked to double check this issue for us. Milliman and I, Scott and Matt, our principal actuaries with Milliman, we had already had a conversation about the revisions to ASAP 4, maybe a year ago, particularly since Scott was very involved with their professional association and kind of developing interpretations and toolkits for that. And then, we came to the same conclusion that Lauren and Trustee McLeod came to independently that we all kind of conferred on last week. So I'm just going to turn it over to Lauren, though, to let him, remembering that Lauren is both an attorney and an actuary.
Recovering actuary. I couldn't I couldn't do any actuarial work at this point to save my life. So when we looked at his comments, and so ASOP number 4, he's right. There was a new ASOP that was published, I believe, in 2021, and it went into effect in mid-2023. And it says that if actuaries do work or issue a report after February, I think 23rd of 23, something like that, they need to reflect new actuarial standards of practice number 4. And what this new ASOP does is, if an actuary is providing to a governmental agency what's called a funding valuation, that funding valuation is required to include certain projections and disclosures and conclusions on contributions that would be required by the plan sponsor to fund the plan. And it requires a number of things. You have to develop an actuarial funding procedure, which is something that Mr. Matches has been, trying to get the fund to do, right? He's saying, we really should, if we're not funding it, we should at least, be looking at how much it would take to, if we wanted to fund it, or if the city wanted to fund it. But his whole comment is predicated on the conclusion that he reached that the work Milliman is doing satisfies ASOP number 4's definition of a funding valuation. And the new ASOP number 4 has a new definition of what a funding valuation is. And we reviewed the definition and compared it to the work product that Milliman has been doing, both for the actual valuation report as well as for the funding levy adequacy report, and have concluded that neither of them are reports that talk about funding. All they're doing is valuing the liabilities in the case of the main valuation report. And that main valuation report is being done in order to provide the city's treasurer and the city accountants with the expensing information they need on their GASB filings, or actually that they need to disclose on the city's financial statements as required by GASB. So that's not a funding valuation. That's just a valuation to determine your liabilities. And then there's the levy adequacy. Well, again, the purpose of the funding, the levy adequacy report is not to determine whether the plan is sufficiently funded at a given benefit level. It's rather to review the benefit payments that are likely going to be made into the foreseeable future, and to review whether the funding requirements that would be, the amount of funding that would be required to pay those benefits might bump up against the levy. Now, if they were to hit the levy, what would that mean? Well, it wouldn't mean that the plan wouldn't get the money to pay the benefits. It just means potentially that the city couldn't look to the levy to fund 100% of the money that's required to pay the benefits. Again, in the unlikely event that were to happen, the city's general fund probably would be the one to have to pay the benefits, right? The money, the benefits has to be paid from somewhere. So in neither case is Milliman's work being undertaken to perform what meets the ASOP number 4 definition of a funding valuation. And because they're not conducting funding valuations, the sections of the new ASOP number 4 that Mr. Matches is saying we need to comply with, or that the actuary should comply with, simply don't apply. So again, I think he's misinterpreting what ASOP number 4 means as a funding valuation. That we've never looked at what would it take to fund the plan. Those valuations are being done for very specific purposes. Again, one is to determine the value of the plan's liabilities for accounting purposes, and the other one is really just an informational item, being good stewards of the city's money. Is there at any point at which we think that the levy might get tapped out, so that the city needs to be made aware of that? Neither of those come to valuation or funding valuations. Those are just regular old actuarial valuations to which ASOP number 4 doesn't apply, or at least this particular aspect of ASOP number 4 doesn't apply to it. So I've got no concerns. I spoke with Milliman, and they confirmed that they don't believe what they are providing are funding valuations within the meaning of ASOP number 4. So we don't think there's anything that we need to do to address ASOP number 4 in this contract renewal.
Thank you, Lauren. I likewise share your interpretation of those facts and don't believe that ASOP 4 applies to the particular valuation work or actuarial work being requested in Milliman from the way I read it. So do any of the other trustees have any questions or concerns about this aspect of it before we talk about contract approval?
I guess I do have one quick question, not being an actuarial, and not understanding the rules that are governing that work. So as far as ASOPs go, are they just recommendations for work done by actuarials, or are they mandates? How does that?
I'll let Kathy respond to that in more substance, but it's basically, it's under, these are all actuarial standards of practice, so that when an actuary does work that is governed by a particular ASOP number, they're supposed to comply with those ASOP rules. And so when you read ASOP number 4, what they're worried about is if you had a municipality or a public fund that was trying to fund the benefit, like for example, PERS. Like PERS has an actual trust fund, and they are actually contributing money to that trust fund, and they're investing that money, and they are trying to get the plan funded, and they actually annually set contribution rates for the various employers in PERS. And those contributions, my understanding, is that the Milliman, as the actuary for that fund, is the ones who are doing the actuarial work to calculate those contribution amounts. So if the state was to try to tell Milliman, we want you to use this set of actuarial assumptions for calculating that, for doing that funding valuation, Milliman might not want to use that particular set of valuation assumptions. And so Milliman, under the ASOPs, wouldn't have to. They could say that the state asked us to use these valuation or these assumptions, but we've concluded that they're not the appropriate assumptions, so we're going to do our own. Again, it just governs what an actuary report has to include. I'm guessing there are some things in there that are mandatory, and I think there's some things in there that are precatory or guidelines. But Kathy, you want to put some gloss on that?
I think that's a very good summary. I mean, overall, the actuarial profession is, like many other professions, a self-regulated profession, and these standards of practice are considered, they're put forth as either definitive or strongly recommended, or depending on the specific subject matter, so that actuaries act in good faith and with good experience and knowledge, and they don't do work they're not qualified for, et cetera. So the goal is to act with utmost professionalism, so that an outside body doesn't come in and regulate instead, that we feel like we're the best stewards of our own good quality work. So that's the purpose of those ASOPs, is to provide that. We have a board of counseling and discipline, and if actuaries do not act in accordance with the ASOPs or other guidance, they are reported to the board of counseling and discipline, and appropriate action is taken. So I think I'll leave it there. But in this particular case, the funding of a plan that's a tricky word, because funding for actuarial purposes in a pension plan typically means pre-funding through a trust. All the benefits are funded eventually, and maybe a distinguishing word is to be financing. So this particular program is being financed through the levy, which is basically directly paying the benefits each year. It's not being pre-funded through a trust.
Right. I think you answered my question. It's in the normal scope of practice for the actuarial company to choose the ASOPs that are going to apply to the work they're doing for that specific analysis.
I would say it differently. I would say the ASOPs do specifically apply to the subject matter at hand. It's the actuary's job to be familiar with, know, and follow the ASOPs in their everyday work as
Okay.
they.
Right.
And trustee
Yeah, and it's not to say that ASOP number 4 doesn't apply to what Milliman is doing. It does apply to what Milliman is doing. But the only parts of ASOP number 4 that apply to what Milliman is doing are the parts that talk about the general rules governing actuarial evaluations performed by an actuary for a governmental plan. If Milliman had, if this fund was like PERS, funding for the benefit, actually putting money aside and trying to hit a target, then Milliman would typically be asked, hey, could you prepare a funding valuation so that we can determine the contributions we need? And if they were doing that, the ASOP number 4 would guide them in terms of what assumptions can you use in performing that work. But again, we're saying that they're not performing the work covered by the particular section of ASOP number 4 that Mr. Matches is referencing. I think it's section 3.21, which, I'd agree if Milliman was performing a funding valuation for you, then Milliman should likely have to include in those reports information about what level of contribution would be required to fund the plan. But again, it's kind of a false premise because we're not using a funding valuation in this particular instance.
Okay, thank you.
And I wanted to say one final thing about this, just to put it a little bit more in context too. When Milliman and I were talking about this the other day, or they were saying, listen, if we thought the ASOP required us to do this, we would do it, whether your board told us to or not, because that's what they do as actuaries. They're going to comply with the ASOPs. Whether the board directed them to provide an ARC or not is not relevant to them. If they think the ASOPs require that, they're going to provide it. The other thing I just want to say is that an ARC is just a number, and if you guys want one, we can get one for you. I mean, it's not a complex. I mean, given all the other, it's just a meaningless number. It is a meaningless number in this context. Sorry, Lord.
I would agree it's a meaningless number. And again, being good stewards of public money, if we asked Milliman to do it, we'd have to pay them to do it.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Why would we pay them to
Why would we
provide what at the end of the day is a worthless number?
Yes, it's a totally meaningless number in the context of our plans.
And I'm sorry, you broke up on my end and you said blank is just a number. What did you say?
Oh, ARC,
Thank you.
actuarial required contribution, I think is what it's sometimes called.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Stacy. And that was that's a good question, Trustee McClowery. The other kind of unique thing about this plan that's I'm sure it's not the only one, but it's somewhat unique about it is typically when a plan is not pre-funded through a trust, which will say, people use the word funded, but pre-funded is the way to do it, say it through a trust. Typically when that's not happening, it's what's called a pay-as-you-go plan. You only pay the benefits when they're due. And oftentimes in that kind of situation, there is no designated source of money for paying the benefits. It's just out of current operating revenues or out of reserves, et cetera. There's no clearly designated source for the money, which is why, generally speaking, a pay-as-you-go program is not a well-considered one because you've got benefit promises, but no promised way to pay the benefit. That's where this program is different in the sense that it does have this specifically designated levy to cover the cost of paying the benefits. And that has been forecasted, and the projected benefit liabilities per year are expected to fall well below that. And that's the significance of that analysis. So it's just, while it is technically called a pay-as-you-go program, it is a very unique one in the sense that it has a clearly designated source of financing. And I'll use financing as opposed to funding because funding typically means a trust. All right, so tricky topic. I do think it's always good to hear the actuary say, hey, if we were required to do this by the standards of practice, we'd do it regardless of what you asked us to do. So with that background, any concerns that we need to take any action with regard to those public comments? I have none. All right, then. Would someone like to make a motion about accepting the Milliman contractors, any specific, I guess I should go back to any specific questions about Milliman's contract other than the one that brought up about the experience study. Any further questions about that?
I make a motion to accept the contract.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second,
Okay, all those in favor of the motion to approve the Milliman contract, please signify by saying aye.
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 All right. Opposed? All right, motion is passed. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, before we move on to information items, Del Stevens is on a call. He called into the meeting and he would like to make comment about the action item 1 cost of living adjustment. So let's get him on the call. Hello, Del, can you hear me?
he's on mute, I believe.
Yeah, he's on mute. Okay. Del, are you still there? Del, can you hear me? There you go. Hi, Del.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, you may want to speak a little louder than normal. And so let's go ahead and start the public comment section for you so you can talk about the cost of living adjustment. You have 3 minutes. Okay, go ahead. Del, can you still hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Okay, go ahead and make your comments, please.
Okay, here I will go. First of all, I want to just identify myself. I'm a former trustee of the board myself, and I spent a term of 3 years on there. And I was also on the mayor's task force for an entire year in 1989 when we reformed our fire and police pension. And at that time, we had a lot of issues that had to be dealt with. And I stayed in touch on all of those. And I could speak to a lot of other issues that the pension should be dealing with at the same time. But right now, I'll confine my comments to the COLA, because I know that's your agenda item. I would just like to say that the city has not kept up with the COLA that is necessary for the retirees to maintain a standard of living based on the amount that they retired at. And I have the actual CPI figures from 2021, January 20th to January 21st. And at that time, the CPI was 7.5% for all consumer items. In 2022, from December 21st to December 22nd, the CPI was 6.5%. Those 2 years alone add up to 14% CPI cost of living increase. During that time, our retired members received a 2% increase on their COLA. And that means that in 2 years, they received 4%, but they lost 10%. Does everybody understand what I'm saying on that? If anybody wants to address that or question me, I'd be happy to take a question. If not, I'll go right ahead. And I would just like to say that the retired members are depending upon the Fire and Police Pension Board. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. anyway, the retired members are depending upon the Fire and Police Pension Board to maintain their pension so that they have a livable lifestyle. The federal cost of living in the year of 2022 was estimated to be $47,000 a year to live in the city of Portland. That's all expenses considered: food, lodging, medical, and other issues. The 2% that you are debating about is not adequate, and the PERS pension has the ability to authorize an ad hoc increase to allow the pensioners to maintain their standard of living. And I think it's time that the city of Portland step up and stand up for their retired members. When we're losing 10% in 2 years of the value of our pension, it's an unfair system and it needs to be corrected. I have more comments I'd love to make, but I probably have exceeded my 3% already. Did you hear everything I said? Okay, Julie?
Hi, Del. Yes, we could hear you. I'm going to mute now and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you for your comments.
All right. Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Of course.
Thank you. Did anybody want to make any comments about that? I mean, at this point, you know, we have no more flexibility to go beyond the 2%, and unless Sam or Stacy wants to speak about, you know, where that would come from for doing any more. I think we're limited. I think the best we are probably allowed to do under our authority is in subsequent years when inflation might be less than 2%, that we continue on approving 2% per year increases to allow some catch up. And I think that's probably the greatest latitude that we've got in the future.
Yeah, that's correct. And the only other form of latitude would be a change to the charter, to the city charter, or a change in the PERS approach. Since the charter does limit the board to the percentage rate of change shall not exceed the percentage rate applied to retirement benefits payable to police and fire employees by the Public Employees Retirement System of the state of Oregon.
Okay.
For 2022, that maximum is 2%.
And again, I think, Sam, last month you provided for us a brief outline about how requested changes to the charter come about and what has to happen there. So if and when there's motivation from within the various forces to try and bring that and start a process such as that, I think we're kind of limited. Any other discussion on that? Okay, I appreciate his comments and certainly sympathize. Should we move on to information items?
Sure, I'll go ahead. I've got a few things to cover here for you. The first thing is you all have received a copy of Margaret Carter's resignation as board chair. I met with representatives from the mayor's office and Commissioner Gonzalez's office to start the search for the mayor's delegate to chair the FPDR board meetings. So basically the chair is supposed to be the mayor, but the mayor can officially delegate it. And so it's mayor's responsibility to select the delegate and then present it to the city council for approval. I was very impressed that the mayor's office and the commissioner's office both jumped on this within less than 2 weeks from when we heard that Chair Carter was resigning. In the past, they've waited 2 to 4 months before they've even started the process. So I'm optimistic they'll get moving ahead on this pretty quick. The new chair we're targeting for the May 26th board meeting. I think that's an optimistic goal, but it's realistic if everybody gets moving fast on that. And we'll keep you up to date when we hear anything or when the mayor makes a selection. Next thing I want to talk to you about is FPDR starting a strategic plan effort. This will be the first time FPDR has ever had a formal strategic plan. This plan that we're going to build will encompass the next 5 years of growth and change within the Bureau and with our members. FPDR, it has to prepare for a changing environment, which includes staff retirements. We have probably a third of our staff can retire over the next 5 years, so we have to be prepared for that. There's new technologies presenting to themselves that can make us more effective and efficient, as well as allow our members to interact with us more effectively. We have changing member expectations, because I think we get different age groups coming in and they have different expectations of what they want as far as service we offer and how we offer it. We also are beginning to see our membership change to what we're 50% FPDR3 and about 50% FPDR2. Each group has slightly different expectations because FPDR3 only looks at FPDRs as their workers' compensation carrier, whereas FPDR2 members look at us both for pension and workers' comp. We're also going to have a new form of government coming in January of 2025. Though the charter changes will have very minimal effect on FPDR, how the city may run the government could change how we do some of our operations with here, not how we deliver goods and services to our members, benefits, but it could change how we operate and who we operate with in the city. So we need to prepare for all of that. And that's why we're doing the strategic plan. So again, we're looking to create a comprehensive future conscious plan, including concrete goals, roles, and accountability framework, and including initial messages for our audience, for our members, what they can expect from us over the next 5 years. We're partnering with a firm called Pregame. It's a Portland-based independent consulting firm. They will guide us through the process and help us create the document. Pregame has consulted with other city bureaus and recently worked with Portland Fire and Rescue to create their strategic plan, so they're familiar with how the city operates. We've used them for a couple other consulting efforts, so they have some familiarity with how FPDR works. So one of the things that we do when we create this plan, we're going to reach out to a lot of stakeholders and ask them their opinions. So we're reaching out with the FPDR staff. I'm going to be reaching out to all of you later this week and try to set some times up to meet and talk over what you expect from FPDR in the future. We've spoken with, we're going to involve the fire and police liaisons. We are going to involve Chief Boone and Chief Lovell. Both have agreed already to conversations with Pregame. We're going to meet with the PPA, PPCOA, and PFFA union presidents. And I think 2 of the 3 presidents have already confirmed time to meet with Pregame to discuss. We're going to reach out to active duty FPDR2 groups and active duty FPDR3. We're going to have slightly different surveys and focus groups for the two, because again, they're how they interact and what they look to FPDR for as far as benefits is different. We're also going to contact and do some surveys and phone interviews with retirees and survivors. So that will be happening over the next couple months, and we expect to have the final plan completed by June 30. You'll be able to see a preliminary part of that, sometime in earlier June. So I think this is a great opportunity for FPDR to get focused on what we want to do over the next 5 years. Again, a lot of changes happening, and I think it's time we have a formal strategic plan on how to proceed. Does anybody have any questions about that?
No, but it sounds like there are a lot of significant things, so it's probably really good timing.
Yeah, it really is. And we went through 2 years of craziness with the pandemic, and that really reinforced that we need a plan, figure out how to move ahead, go forward, and be able to be adaptable to future issues coming on.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay.
And I agree with you, Sam. I think certainly this work is important for the future of PDR, and I'm glad that you guys have engaged an outside consultant to help you through that process. And one question that I have is that, was this budget in the planned budget for this year? And how does that affect the budget for the remainder of the year?
Stacy, go for it.
Yes, we budgeted for this as part of our consulting services budget for the year. Yes.
Great.
Good question.
And just to let you know, pregame, what they did for us before is they went with the disability team with Kim's oversight to do some process improvements, because we went very quickly from a paper file to paperless file, and we needed to catch up with it, and that used them to help us look at our processes on that. And then also we had 2 very tenured employees retire this year. And so we asked them to do some, take them out to lunch and do an in-depth interview, what they thought was working well with FPDR, what were some suggested changes, because these people have a lot of knowledge and they've seen a lot of things come and go in FPDR. So we really wanted to get their input, which turned out to be very valuable. And we'll probably see a little bit of both those efforts working their way either directly or indirectly into the strategic plan.
Thank you.
Okay. And just a last thing on my list here is future meeting agendas. So for May 23rd is our next board meeting. It will be in person / hybrid if we need to. So we will not be doing the annual benefit adjustments. So I'll strike that off the agenda. That was settled today. We will do the tax anticipation notes, authorization for those, and Stacy will lead that discussion. We will have the PERS and independent actuaries do their ETOB test presentation they were going to do last week. I'll give you a legislative update. We'll be far enough in it. We'll probably be at that point 90% of the way through the legislature, so I can tell you some of the bills that will impact directly or indirectly FPDR. July 25th, typically it's a meeting gets canceled every so often. So tentatively, we have, again, the final legislative update, because we'll definitely know what bills have gone through at that time. And there are a couple bills that we may want to not copy the bill, but copy some of the intent of the bill into some FPDR administrative rules. Kim and I will talk about those, and we may present you the concept in July 25th. Then in September 26th, we'll have the state of FPDR, and if we do have any rule changes, we'll formally present them to you at that time for a vote. So that's everything that I've got on the list for today.
Okay, thank you. As far as the PERS equal to or better than test, I know that generated comments from members about the test. I know we're going to have actuaries present to talk about the results of the analysis and the methodology and the rules. Whether we talk about it here or not, do we need to allow some time, perhaps in July, to take up any questions that may come up relating to that ETOB test?
Well, I think you can. I mean, that's up to you all if you feel there's any outstanding issues that the board needs to address regarding the ETOB. I do know that there will be 1 to maybe 2 retirees that will come in and provide their input on the ETOB with that. But then again, at the end of that, you can make a decision if you want to add that to agenda item in July.
Okay.
Sam, I sent you a list of questions regarding the ETOB. Did they get
Yep.
forwarded? Did they get forwarded to the actuarials?
Yes, they have it, and they will be answering all those questions for
Thank
you.
you.
Perfect.
And then the staff put together a series of questions that we often have heard from our members and from other stakeholders. And so we added those into the list too.
Appreciate that. Well, with luck, we will have everything resolved during that May meeting, and we won't need any follow-up, but we can make that decision next month as time comes. Any other topics, trustees, anything else that you want to consider for agenda or anything else before we adjourn?
I don't have an agenda topic, but I do have a quick question, if I may, regarding the meeting notes that are sent out before we look at each before each meeting. It was my impression, we talked about them 5 or 6 months ago, that we're going to be using this auto dictation format for the notes. Just quickly, are they being then read by someone on staff for any small editing that needs, or are they just being sent straight out through the editing software that's being used, or dictation software?
Julie, you want to talk about what you do before you publish them?
Hi. Yes, we're provided a transcript from our captioning service, and basically what I do is I organize them, and then I do listen to the meeting and read along and make sure that anything is not misrepresented. Sometimes there are, of course, some typos and words that weren't understood, because especially when you're talking about the more detailed things like the actuarial services and stuff like that. But I do go through them and I make sure that everything that is being said is represented in the minutes that are passed out.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
The default is the actual recording of the meeting minutes, which you can find on the website. We don't correct if somebody says something they maybe didn't want to say. Well, sorry, you said it. It's in the recording and it's in there. So we capture that as it was stated.
So all of our ums and ahs and ahems, those were all included as
Well,
well.
they're good. They don't include those, but I think there's been a couple times that we've seen some people, me being one, get tongue-tied, and so the tongue-tiedness comes across in the minutes, and that's what we do. So basically what I'm saying is we don't edit the content. We make it clarified, making sure that it matches to what was said on the recording.
Thank you. All right. Anything else for the good of the order this afternoon? All right, with that then, I think we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have a
very
good
much.
one, everybody. Thank you all.
All right, take
Take
care.
care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.